茂先生，甲前美国在台协会办事处的处长司徒文先生来甲咱演讲。We now begin our first section, U.S. rebalancing policy and recent developments of peace and security in Asia-Pacific region. Please welcome our moderator, former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dr. Gao Yingmao, and our speaker, the Director of National Tsinghua University Center of Asia Policy, Dr. William Stanton. 各位歹势，咱换一个倒啊，甲迄个。 咱来邀请各处长甲司徒文先生。
罗大师，各位乡亲、学者、专家，今仔日有即个机会来主持第一场的即个会议，我感觉真正光荣，因为今仔日咱有2个非常重要的专家来做即个演讲，来继续咱有3位学者来做评论。 希望即个时间有充分的时间来做我即个甲大家各位听众的即个对话。为着争取时间我想即个3部分，也是可能4部分的即个进程咱可能分做2部分。第一部分就是即个Stanton 大师。 也是即个教授伊来先做伊的即个第一批论文的即个演讲，来刷落去，咱有20分钟的即个休息，来搁再进行即个第一场的第2部分。今仔日我拄仔有讲过，即个学者我该对 对咱单位该这个用这个中国话来讲，可能我们一些听众可能对这个中国话国语比较熟悉那么我们这个大使中国话也非常讲得非常好，所以我想改变成中国话来做一些简单的这个介绍。我刚刚一直强调说，今天我们有2篇非常非常好的这个论文，因为这2篇的这个作者都是全世界难得找到的这个专家像在我左边的这个史图文这个处长或者大使他对这个台湾的这个实际的经验对美国外交政策国务院的这个整个对全世界的这个政策的推动，从非洲到亚洲，那么在亚洲呢，特别他在这个中国、香港、韩国都有非常非常深入的这个经验。那么自从2009年开始他就到台湾AIT 来当处长。他在他34年的这个外交的这个生涯里边呢，可以说有非常非常好的这个绩效同时也得到美国国务院的这个肯定给他很多的这种专业的奖励所以今天像这种人很不容易，他不只是有博士的学位，有学问的这个基础，同时有很多实际的这个经验那么这一点呢我想很多学者虽然知识非常的深入但是经验这一方面就比较缺少。所以今天我们首先能够有第一位这个史图文这个大使来给我们做这个专题的演讲分析整个这个美国这个再平衡的政策跟我们台湾在这个再平衡政策里边应该扮演的角色，我想这个是非常非常难得的机会。所以首先我来就请我们史图文这个大使给我们做演讲。
Thank you, Dr. Gao, and thank you, Dr. Law, for inviting me, and thank you to the members of the Taiwan National Security Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, 请你们原谅我，因为我要说英文，可是我想你可以看我的课文在旁边。The U.S. pivot to Asia was both inevitable and it was necessary. For much of my diplomatic career, and for the most part since World War II, U.S. foreign policy was principally focused on both the Soviet Union and a divided Europe and also the Middle East. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the withdrawal of U.S. troops finally from Iraq, and the announcement of the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan were all world-changing decisions, and they had huge consequences requiring a reorientation of U.S. foreign policy. It was also natural that the United States would turn to Asia. After all, Asia has half the world's people. It includes many of the key allies of the United States and several of the key engines of economic growth in the world. In economic terms alone, redirection toward Asia was necessary when you consider that as of 2013, East Asian countries and India alone accounted for 1/3 of the world's GDP, gross domestic product. In some respects, the pivot represented not so much an innovation, but a return to a former status quo, since from a military point of view, many of the troops that were sent to the Middle East and Afghanistan were drawn down from U.S. Pacific Command and also from U.S. Forces Korea. and they were allowed to return. Even before the pivot was announced, the Obama administration signaled a commitment of greater attention to Asia. Secretary Clinton's first trip as Secretary of State, and she was the only Secretary of State to do so, she visited Asia, the first trip abroad. By the time she had announced the pivot, she had made 7 more trips to Asia. In his first month in office, President Obama chose as his first foreign visitor to the White House Japan's Prime Minister Taro Aso. So during the course of the first 4 years of the Obama administration, Secretary Clinton visited 14 East Asian countries, including all the members of ASEAN. In stark contrast, I was in the State Department at the time, Secretary Rice was the first Secretary of State to miss the ASEAN Regional Forum since it was established. And she missed it not once, but actually twice. In 2005 and again in 2007. It was quite clear she didn't much like going there. There were also, of course, many people, if you count visits as a signal of your interest in Asia, if you don't go to Asia, if you don't make the trips, then people criticize the pivot for not working. And that happened when the US Congress shut down Washington over the budget crisis in October of 2013. And there was also a continuing debate from the beginning about whether the US government even had the funds because of budget drawbacks to support a pivot to Asia. But it was quite clear when the Quadrennial Defense Review came out in March of this year, as the consistent with Secretary of Defense Hagel's view, as it was announced, the rebalanced Asia can and will continue despite the budget constraints that they had to face. Since the very beginning, the idea of a pivot has been much debated, including its name. Many people didn't have preferred in the Obama administration calling it a rebalancing, because if you pivot, you turn your back on someone. And in particular, the Europeans were sensitive to the idea that the US was turning away from them. And one commentator said it was a shift away from Europe was an invitation to trouble. This seemed to come true with the crisis in Ukraine, Russia's seizure of Crimea, Moscow's support of separatists in the eastern Ukraine, and then subsequently also problems again in the Middle East, the Israeli invasion of Gaza, fighting in Syria and Iraq, turmoil in Libya, and now the rise of ISIL, which are now committed to fight. More challenges for Washington. There have also been a range of views about the advisability of the pivot. On the one hand, you had people like former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who said it was entirely appropriate. He said without such a move, there was a danger that China, with its hardline, realist view of international relations, would conclude that an economically exhausted United States was losing its staying power in the Pacific. Henry Kissinger, who now portrays himself as an expert on China and admitted that he was a big fan of China, said that he himself said the Asia pivot was inevitable, but later he changed his mind and in a more recent interview this year said it was largely a slogan. And he said friends in Asia had told him, after all, upon hearing about the pivot to Asia, said, quote, we never knew you'd left. Others had seen the pivot as provocative and danger. One professor in foreign affairs argued that it would unnecessarily compound Beijing's insecurities and would only feed China's aggressiveness. Another professor said it lacked serious substance. And perhaps the most biting critique came from an Indian geostrategist, Brahma Chilani, who said that the pivot remained more rhetorical than real. and that Asian nations now harbor gnawing doubts about the reliability of the United States as a security shield. He claimed that Obama's, quote, feckless Asia policy has helped deepen these nations' security dilemma on how to protect their territorial rights against an assertive, well-armed, and authoritarian China that seeks to change facts on the ground, slice by slice, salami style. It's nonetheless important to note that there have been some very concrete measures in this pivot to Asia. In July of 2009, Secretary Clinton, the first person to do so, signed for the United States the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation with Southeast Asia, which the Bush administration had refused to do. On his first trip to Asia in 2009, in November, President Obama reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. In 2010, the United States became the first non-ASEAN country to establish a dedicated diplomatic mission to ASEAN in Jakarta. At the ASEAN Regional Forum in July of 2010, I'll talk about that a bit more later, Secretary Clinton declared that peaceful multilateral resolution of competing sovereignty claims in the South China Sea was a U.S. national interest. In September of 2011, the United States and Vietnam, they signed a Memorandum of Understanding on advancing bilateral defense cooperation. And indeed, more recently, you've probably seen in the media talk about the possibility that the U.S. would change its policy and sell weapons to Vietnam. In November of 2011, President Obama announced an agreement with Australia to deploy on a rotational basis 2,500 Marines to Darwin or in the north of Australia. In July of 2013, President Obama and Vietnam's president issued a joint statement on establishing a U.S.-Vietnam comprehensive partnership. And in April of 2014, the United States and the Philippines signed an enhanced defense cooperation agreement, a 10-year military pact that allows the rotational basing of U.S. forces and supplies throughout the Philippines. I would add here, too, that Japan's shift in its defense policy obviously, I think, came with the support and the encouragement of the United States. The PRC certainly took the pivot seriously. Although not in the official media, in the semi-official media, they said that it was destabilizing, the pivot was destabilizing to regional order, ran against prevailing international trends, and was an expression of a deliberate U.S. effort to counterbalance or contain China, its growing power and influence in Asia. In my view, however, the most telling evidence of the importance of the pivot to China was the fact that in 2012, the official Xinhua Shi, the official Chinese news agency, named the pivot as the #1 world event in 2012. In contrast, in a similar associated poll of US editors about top stories in 2012, the pivot wasn't even mentioned. The response of Asian countries has varied. Some, like Japan, the Philippines, India, welcomed it, while others, like Indonesia and Malaysia, were more ambivalent. Asians are all in a dilemma. They have all, including China, generally prospered from the peace and stability that US security has provided, certainly since at least 1975 with the end of the Vietnam War. Most Asian countries recognize that the United States has no territorial ambitions in Asia, and that the presence of our forces here has been largely benign and positive, and serves as a welcome counterbalance to China's growing power in the region and its growing domination. At the same time, all Asian countries, including Taiwan, have increasingly benefited from trade with China, on which they were also increasingly dependent. They also fear the potential for a conflict between China and the United States. It's not surprising, therefore, that in a June 2014 interview with Forbes magazine, the President Ma offered a generally positive but carefully, diplomatically nuanced comment on the pivot. Quote, he said, "The U.S. rebalance to Asia is to many Asian nations seen as something basically acceptable, because these countries, to a greater or lesser extent, rely for their security on the U.S., but are also willing to deal with mainland China for economic reasons. So they hope to find a balance point between the U.S. and mainland China. As long as this works well, it is a net positive for the region." So a bit conditional. Secretary Clinton's essay on foreign policy in October 2011, which announced the pivot, was very carefully worded, probably written, I would imagine, by Kurt Campbell and also by Jeff Bader at the National Security Council. In 7 of the 52 paragraphs in her article devoted to China, she was very careful to deny seeing China as a threat. In fact, of course, however, the pivot really is about China, always has been. China's dramatic economic and military expansion is what has most changed Asia in the past 20 or so years. In addition to the quest for cooperation, therefore, that Secretary Clinton emphasized in talking about China in her article, she also noted the many areas in which bilateral cooperation with China has been particularly lacking, including, and the list I think could go even further, military-to-military engagement, maritime security, cybersecurity, fair and open trade, intellectual property protection, currency valuation, North Korea, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, the South China Sea, and human rights. They were all cited by her. In assessing the significance of the pivot, its staying power, and its implications for Taiwan, it's important to understand how PRC behavior altered Obama administration thinking about China. I'm going to make 3 points. First, about the Obama attitude toward China early in the administration, prior to his November 2009 visit to Beijing. Second of all, a March 2010 visit following the arms sales to Taiwan by Jeff Bader from the National Security Council and the Deputy Secretary of State Steinberg. And third of all, in July of 2010, Secretary Clinton's visit to the ASEAN Regional Forum, where a huge fight broke out with Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi over the territorial claims in the South China Sea. Now, when Obama came to power in 2009, they reviewed previous presidencies and they noticed a similarity in almost all of them, which is that presidents came in criticizing China and then had to walk back from that in order to develop a constructive relationship. This is true in 1980 when Ronald Reagan criticized President Carter for breaking relations with Taiwan and then decided he had to have a constructive relationship anyway with China. It was true of Bill Clinton in 1992 when, as a candidate, he talked about the butchers of Beijing. And when I was in Beijing in '98, he came and signed a joint statement calling for the need to build a constructive strategic relationship, a big transformation. And it was true in 2000 when George W. Bush would criticize Clinton for treating China as a strategic partner rather than a strategic competitor, later changed his mind and decided he needed cooperation with China as well. So whether for strategic or trade reasons, they all altered course. So it's clear from the recollections of those who were in the Obama administration in the first term that they were intent on breaking that pattern, even going so far as to avoid Obama meeting with the Dalai Lama so they would get off on the right foot with the Chinese. So when they went on the November trip to Beijing, they hoped for great success. And they were sadly disappointed. In effect, they came away with nothing. As the New York Times summarized the visit at the time, in 6 hours of meetings at 2 dinners and during a stilted 30-minute news conference at which President Hu Jintao did not allow questions, President Obama was confronted on his first visit with a fast-rising China more willing to say no to the United States. The trip did more to showcase China's ability to push back against outside pressure than it did to advance the main issues on Obama's agenda. Following the visit, a White House staffer, and I know this secondhand, reportedly said to a NSC colleague words to the effect of, well, if, as you say, the United States needs China to solve so many regional and global and bilateral issues, then after this visit, I guess we can say we're not going to make progress on any of these issues. In fact, the whole visit was a sobering reminder of the difficulty of cooperating with China, particularly a China that was feeling triumphant after it emerged from the 2007-8 global economic crisis and viewed the United States as a declining power. Now, the second event which I mentioned was when Jeff Bader and James Steinberg went to Beijing in early March of 2010. Originally, the Chinese canceled the visit because they were furious about, or at least wanted to show their unhappiness about the January 29 US announcement of a $6.4 billion arms sales to Taiwan. While the US went to discuss a range of issues, all the Chinese wanted to talk about were the arms sales and how they should stop, and sort of indicated that that was a trade-off if we were going to make progress elsewhere. They also, for the first time, although this has subsequently been debated, what language was actually used, but the recollection of many people was that, in fact, they described for the first time the South China Sea as a core interest along the lines of Taiwan. Secretary Clinton reportedly heard the same thing, it was from Dai Bingguo, during the second round of the China-US Strategic and Economic Dialogue in May of 2010. So the third event, when Secretary Clinton went to the ASEAN Regional Forum in July of 2010, the South China Sea was high on her agenda. Now, it was quite clear that the Chinese went out of their way to ensure that the South China Sea would not be raised during the course of this conference. And that effort clearly failed when the first 11 of participating and ASEAN foreign ministers all expressed their concerns about peace and security in the South China Sea. Speaking next, after those 11, Secretary Clinton stated peaceful resolution of territorial claims in the South China Sea was in the U.S. national interest. She called for a collaborative diplomatic process by all claimants for resolving the various territorial disputes without coercion. And she also said that the U.S. had a national interest in freedom of navigation, open access to Asia's maritime commons, and respect for international law in the South China Sea. Now, there's no transcript of what happened thereafter, but all the recollections are clear that a furious Yang Jiechi, and having worked a total of 6 years in Beijing, I've seen him get furious. A furious Yang Jiechi got up and left the room for about an hour. And when he came back, he lashed out at both Secretary Clinton and at the other ministers who had dared to talk about the South China Sea. He reminded the Southeast Asians that China was big and that they were small, and that their economic ties, and of their strong economic ties to China, and he implicitly threatened the possibility that those ties could be broken. Backlash continued in subsequent months on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website of China. Secretary Clinton was accused of attacking China at the ARF meeting in an effort to give the international community a wrong impression that the situation in the South China Sea was a cause for grave concern. Later, when she visited Beijing in September of 2010, she originally had a meeting with Xi Jinping, then Vice President Xi Jinping, then Vice President, he wasn't clearly going to be named. He canceled the meeting with her. And she couldn't have expected a positive meeting with them, particularly in the South China Sea, when the Global Times on the day of her arrival printed an editorial accusing her of having, quote, fomented frictions between China and some surrounding countries, and called on her to reflect on the deep harm that she is bringing to the Sino-US relationship. But at the same time, as she recalled in an interview in September 20th of 2012 in the New York Times, many Asian countries privately welcomed the tougher US stance toward China. As she said, quote, time and time again, I had leaders, I'm talking about the highest leaders, actually essentially said, thank goodness, thank you, I'm so pleased you're here. We were worried about America. So what you hear in public from Asian countries is not always what the United States hears from them in private. It was, of course, not US diplomacy that inspired the territorial disputes. We recall that as early as 1974, China seized the Western Paracel Islands from Vietnam, and they took over Mischief Reef from the Philippines in 1995. Nonetheless, as early as November 2002, Chinese and ASEAN foreign ministers had agreed on a non-binding South China Sea Code of Conduct, which basically called for solving problems by peaceful means and in accordance with the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Needless to say, despite these commitments, the Code of Conduct was subsequently entirely ignored by China. And instead, there were a series of provocative actions in the South China Sea. I'll only mention a few of the more recent ones. In July of 2012, the Chinese erected a barrier to the entrance of the disputed Scarborough Shoal, and Chinese government ships remained there, continuing to turn away Filipino vessels. In January of 2013, of course, the Philippines took China to the International Court of Arbitration, and the Chinese refused to participate. In November of 2013, the PRC unexpectedly announced the air identification zone for the East China Sea, which included the Diaoyutai and Senkaku Islands. In May of 2014, there was the major incident when Vietnamese naval ships and Chinese vessels clashed when the Chinese moved in an enormous oil rig. Subsequently, Vietnamese ships were rammed and one Vietnamese ship was sunk, and this was all caught on videotape. If you go online, you can see pictures of it. This led to prolonged demonstrations and protests actually throughout the world, many of them in Vietnam, unfortunately directed against Taiwanese companies. In August, as recently as August, the Chinese official announced that the Spratly Islands are China's intrinsic territory, and what China does or doesn't do is up to China alone. And more recently, even, they announced that they're going to build 5 lighthouses in the South China Sea. They've already got 1 or 2, including on at least 2 of the islands that are claimed by Vietnam. So if the pivot to Asia is really about China, it's really about Taiwan as well. It has to be. Ironically, perhaps not surprisingly, Taiwan doesn't have much to say about the pivot. The only real statement is the one I mentioned by President Ma. And publicly, at least, the United States almost never talks about Taiwan's role in the pivot. Scholars do, our military people do, but the US government doesn't. The only instance that was cited earlier of an official US statement came in a submitted statement by our Assistant Secretary Danny Russell for East Asia, and it was significantly on the anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act on April 3 of this year, when he said, strengthening our relations with Taiwan and our long-standing relationship with the people in Taiwan remains a key element of the US strategic rebalance to the Asia-Pacific. There was, however, no further elaboration or explanation of how that was going to happen. Both the United States and Taiwan face a serious dilemma. Although we're long-standing partners and friends, we're joined by common values, shared interests. We enjoy strong trade ties, security, education, people-to-people ties, close cooperation in many areas. But both sides feel constrained about what they say and about what they do in the relationship, especially with regard to the military. Taiwan, concerned about its important relationship with China, the United States continues to refuse to sell Taiwan many of the weapons or help them obtain many of the weapons they really need, such as diesel-electric submarines. That Taiwan really needs to improve its self-defense capability. Meanwhile, Taiwan has vastly improved its relations with China over the last 6 years, and thus has become increasingly economically dependent on the mainland and bound by its cross-strait relationship. At the same time, Taiwan's military budget has declined, and President Ma's clear defensive priority is above all maintaining a stable relationship with the mainland. Now, as early as the 16th century, Europeans noted the strategic importance of Taiwan. General MacArthur drew attention to this when he wanted to draw a perimeter on the first island chain to prevent the spread of communism. And it does not go unnoticed nowadays by either the PLA or the US Armed Forces. For the PLA, it is just important now, Taiwan, as both a potential defensive and offensive asset. We don't talk about this, but Chinese military writers actually write about it. Taiwan is necessarily a top priority for both Chinese and US military planners in the still unlikely event of a conflict, although, again, this is a subject that doesn't receive much attention. It is not surprising, therefore, that some US analysts have called attention to the significant strategic role that Taiwan could and should play in the US pivot. One of those is Michael Maza, writing in Asia Outlook, who pointed out that Taiwan is uniquely poised to be an important part, an important component of the security relationship in the pivot. And he particularly pointed to potential Taiwan contribution to cyber knowledge, communication abilities, and intelligence. Now, such views are really accurate. They're certainly accurate. The only drawback is that they appear unlikely to be implemented given self-imposed constraints in both Taiwan and the United States. We should not underestimate the difficulty of undertaking intensified cooperation with Taiwan without PRC knowledge and intense opposition. Taiwan also faces some contradictions in its policies towards settling Asian maritime disputes in the East and South China Seas, which are a key aspect of the US pivot to Asia. Most important, Taiwan shares with the PRC the same territorial claims in both seas, although their manner of addressing these claims is very different in some significant respects. President Ma Ying-jeou, we all know, has been preoccupied with Taiwan's sovereignty over the Diaoyutai Senkaku Islands. His dissertation at Harvard was about this. He's made it clear in many meetings that he believes the Diaoyutai Islands belong to the Republic of China. Nevertheless, and to his credit, he proposed on August 5th, 2012, an innovative 5-point East China Peace Initiative, which urged all parties to refrain from antagonism, observe international law, peacefully resolve disputes, and find a mechanism for exploring and developing resources on a cooperative basis. And consistent with this initiative, in April of 2013, Taiwan reached a widely acclaimed fisheries agreement with Japan that settled the fishing disputes that had been taking place around these islands. Taiwan deservedly got credit for this, and China was clearly unhappy that Taiwan had gone ahead without an okay from China in doing so. Meanwhile, China has persisted rather than seeking an agreement of that kind with aggressive naval and air power patrols, and Japan then has responded in kind. One naval expert, James Holmes, pointed out by signing the agreement, Taiwan favorably differentiated itself from China, showed it could behave in a mature and civilized manner, and also signaled its sovereign status by acting on its own. Meanwhile, Taiwan's pursued a similar agreement with the Philippines. By all accounts, it just lacks a signature in Manila, and apparently has already been implemented. I hope that's the case. The U.S. Defense Secretary Hagel in May actually praised Taiwan and Philippines for this agreement. In contrast, at the August 8, 2014 meeting with the ASEAN foreign ministers in Myanmar, China rejected the Philippine proposal, which the US and some other ASEAN countries supported, for a freeze on perceived provocative acts. Foreign Minister Wang Yi, clearly just said no, not up for discussion. And of course, as I mentioned, they've refused to participate in the International Court of Arbitration. Unlike the handling of the East China Sea dispute, Taiwan's policy towards the South China Sea is more similar to that of China, principally because, first of all, the claims are both based on the so-called 9-dash line, which stems from the original 11-dash line, which was formulated by the Republic of China in a map on December 1, 1947. A map which lacks specific geographic coordinates and has never been explained how those lines, those dashes, would ever be connected. There used to be 11 lines, but Zhou Enlai on his own decided that they would get rid of 2 of them in the Gulf of Tonkin. Taiwan's handling of Taiping Island also in some respects is similar to the Chinese actions on the islands that it's occupied. In recent years, the PRC's established armed garrisons on many islets and islands, radar and communication facilities, artillery, missiles, built artificial islands from the many sand shoals in the region, constructed piers, airstrips, and other structures. And Taiwan, which has occupied Taiwan Island on a continuous basis, certainly since 1956, when the permanent presence was first established, Taiwan has built an airport, navigational antenna, and has announced that it's spending a lot of money to upgrade the airstrip, to construct a dock, and in April of 2011 announced that it was going to put Marines back on the island rather than Coast Guard. Despite the shared basis of China and Taiwan's claims to the South China Sea and the similarities I've noted in the treatment of the territories, Taiwan has notably refused to cooperate with the PRC in handling territorial claims. They've emphasized, that this is a matter they'll handle on their own, to which I give Taiwan great credit. In fact, President Ma himself, in August of 2014, suggested on the second anniversary of his East China Sea Peace Initiative that the fisheries agreement with Japan should be used as a basis of a framework for resolving territorial claims in the South China Sea. Now, I see two problems with that. One is that because there are overlapping multilateral claims, the negotiation would be more complex. But even more important is the premise of that fisheries agreement is that you can reap the advantages of the natural resources that may be there without resolving the sovereignty dispute. But I'm rather convinced by an article written by a Harvard fellow that was published in Foreign Policy, which was titled, "It's Not About the Oil, It's About the Tiny Rocks." And our point was, although nobody knows for sure what lies in the South China Sea, the most definitive study thus far, which was done by the US Department of Energy International Energy Analysis Agency, said that there's probably not very much in the disputed areas. If there's any oil and gas, it's very close to the coastlines of the various countries in question. And she argued, moreover, that it's certainly nothing worth going to war for, particularly since China is a net importing oil country. If the oil prices go down because there's oil discovered there, it just as well serves China's interests. She pessimistically concluded China's energy exploration efforts are about demonstrating sovereignty and control, and not vice versa. Now, given how intractable and dangerous this dispute is over the South China Sea, Taiwan should seriously consider abandoning its claims based on the 9 dashes. The US government has already publicly proposed such a course for China. On February 5th, 2014, Assistant Secretary Danny Russell stated that under international law, maritime claims in the South China Sea must be derived from land features. Any use of the 9-dash line by China to claim maritime rights not based on claimed land features would be inconsistent with international law. Jeff Bader, as a fellow at Brookings, followed up. He went further, and he recommended that the US government make clear to other claimants, that would include Taiwan, he didn't say Taiwan, that we expect them to be public in their rejection of the 9-dash line. Specifically, Bader recommended that the United States discuss with Taiwan whether it can clarify its position on the 9-dash line. Another scholar, though, Patrick Cronin, went further in what he called the bold maritime strategy. He argued that Beijing is unlikely to alter its coercive policies to settle these disputes, and recommended that Taiwan should redefine its maritime claims, not on the basis of historical rights, but on the basis of contemporary international law. And he also proposed that President Ma courageously announce a moratorium on building on Taiping Island, aligning Taiwan with the recent US call for a freeze on new infrastructure. Now, there's already some domestic political support for such an approach. Ambassador Joseph Wu, as you know, Secretary General of the Democratic Progressive Party, in an article in The Diplomat on May 14th of this year on the future of US-Taiwan relations himself, said Taiwan should make clear that it follows the US Convention on the Law of the Sea in defining its territorial claims based on actual ownership of Taiping Island, and adheres to the principle of freedom of navigation. Now, by doing so, in my view, Taiwan would align its national policy with international law. It would publicly call attention to its role and its stake in the outcome of the territorial disputes. It would differentiate, again, its approach from Beijing's aggressive and purely self-serving policies, and possibly put pressure on Beijing to take a more constructive approach. It would reinforce its reputation already established with Japan and the Philippines as a peacemaker rather than a troublemaker. And in the process of doing so, it would assume a major role in and make a significant contribution to achieving a key goal of the U.S. pivot to Asia, which is fundamentally intended to maintain and foster continued stability, security, and prosperity in Asia. The United States itself, however, also needs to support any Taiwan initiative to base its territorial claims on international law. Most importantly, the United States the U.S. Senate should finally ratify itself the U.S. Convention on Law of the Sea, which is still not done. As Jeff Bader has put it, we should put our money where our mouth is. The U.S. also bears a responsibility to support Taiwan's role in the pivot to Asia in other ways. To begin with, the U.S. should end its silence about the positive role Taiwan can and should take. At a minimum, it makes no sense to call on China to abandon the 9-dash line and not call on Taiwan explicitly to do the same. There is also no point in a continued U.S. deference to Beijing's sensitivities. Beijing has been quite frank about it, that it believes the U.S. has no business involving itself in the South China Sea, or in Asia for that matter. On May 21 in Shanghai, Chinese President Xi Jinping called for a new Asia security concept, which essentially meant that anyone outside of Asia should have no say in security issues in Asia. He's also called in the past for a halt to so-called interference in cross-strait relations and to arms sales to Taiwan, to lift limits on technology transfers to China, to end freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea. In effect, the U.S. should get out of Asia and concede to and facilitate the strategic dominance of the PRC in Asia. This is what China means by the new type of strategic relationship it wants with the United States. There's no point in denying any longer that the U.S. and Chinese versions of Asia are fundamentally at odds. It has therefore been encouraging to me to see a tougher tone in what U.S. officials are saying about China. The Chinese don't believe U.S. rhetoric to the contrary anyway. While the U.S. needs to maintain a civil tone in its diplomatic exchanges, must cooperate where it can, and avoid making its friends in Asia who fear Chinese wrath more anxious, the United States also needs to continue to be very clear about its own values and its interests in Asia. Those U.S. values and interests require the United States more actively to demonstrate its support for Taiwan, the two most important areas where the United States needs to do more are, of course, defense cooperation and trade. Progress in both areas certainly also requires efforts on Taiwan's part, including a stronger Taiwan commitment to its defense budget and greater liberalization of Taiwan's markets. Nonetheless, the United States should be more proactive. It is in the U.S. economic and strategic interest to bring Taiwan into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. For virtually every free trade agreement the U.S. has ever signed, there have been political motives as well as economic motives for going into the agreement. I could go into that in detail. If that is too difficult, given the U.S. partners on whom China can exert pressure in the TPP, the United States should seek a separate bilateral free trade agreement with Taiwan, perhaps beginning with a bilateral investment agreement. In an interview with the Taipei-based Business Weekly on June the 19th, even former Secretary of State Clinton expressed concern about Taiwan's overdependence on mainland China that might cost Taiwan its independence. She said Taiwan will have to decide how dependent economically you want to become. But she noted that possible vulnerabilities might have unintended consequences. While acknowledging it was understandable and appropriate for Taiwan to forge relations with China, she also affirmed that the United States had been willing to support Taiwan in many ways against China's objections, and we will continue to do so. One of the main means of support for defense cooperation and a secure Taiwan is a principal requirement for stable and secure Asia for geostrategic reasons. The United States must do more to get Taiwan the weapons it needs for self-defense, especially, in my view, asymmetric defense systems like submarines and improved missile technology. More frequent and higher level military dialogue are also required. More broadly, the United States must continue to strengthen its military ties with other Asian allies and friends, including with India. To conclude, even in the absence of a US pivot, China's increasingly aggressive zero-sum drive for hegemony in Asia has yielded counterbalancing effect, driving countries like Japan, the Philippines, and Vietnam closer to the United States, and in some cases to one another. It's led to the purchase of Russian submarines by the Vietnamese. It's led to many other changes which I could cite, including a notable strengthening of India's defenses. Also, it's worth noting the recent Pew survey on international attitudes noted that whatever consequences there have been for China's recent activities in the South China Sea, its territorial disputes, it has not improved the image of China. The survey showed that China's rising power generates its own anxieties. Among the 8 countries surveyed, China, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Philippines, South Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam, majorities in each country said they were concerned that territorial disputes between China and neighboring countries could lead to a military conflict. In the Philippines, Japan, Vietnam, South Korea, and India, more than 70% said this was a concern. It was even a concern for 62% of Chinese. And the number of those concerned was especially high in the Philippines, 93%, Japan, 85%, Vietnam, 84%, and South Korea, 83%. Unfortunately, Taiwan was not included in the survey as it was not included in the US pivot. So to sum up, the US pivot to Asia was inevitable and necessary. Despite criticism of it, it's accomplished more than is generally acknowledged. Most Asian countries have welcomed increased US attention, involvement, and reassurance. The pivot is a response to the rise of China economically and militarily, and the potentially dangerous consequences of the rise are most clearly evident in the PRCs, or why we have the pivot is because of the PRC's aggressive policies in pursuit of territorial claims in the East and South China Sea. Taiwan is rarely mentioned in the context of the pivot, but it can and should play a major role. I've described how. It has an important economic and security role to play. Both Taiwan and the United States should do much more. Thank you very much.